Okay, well, welcome everyone to this second installment of our series, The Political Economy of Rising Authoritarianism. Last time we looked at the Middle East, and today we'll move east to China. My name is C.K. Lee, and I teach sociology at UCLA. I'm the moderator of this panel. In the past decade, the world has become familiar with the Chinese name Xi Jinping. And I'm sure many of you would point to his rise as the main reason behind the resurgence of authoritarianism, or some even would say totalitarianism in China. But as social scientists and historians, we know personal political ambitions alone cannot pull off such a regime-level shift in governance. We also need to look at the political, economic, and social forces that sustain or subvert autocratization, whether worldwide or in one country. That means we need to ask questions such as, who are the party bosses making up China's authoritarian regime? What is the social composition of the Chinese elite? Has there been any elite circulation? How does the Chinese Communist Party relate to the powerful IT business elite? For instance, people like Jack Ma and Pony Ma, CEOs of Alibaba and Tencent, respectively. How should we make sense of Xi Jinping's recent crackdown on them? And finally, China's zero COVID policy is increasingly isolating its economy and society from the rest of the world. How will the global supply chain and domestic social stability be affected? So this afternoon, we're very fortunate to have two very prominent China scholars with us to analyze these questions. Our first speaker is Professor Victor Shih, who holds the Ho Miu Lam Chair in China and Pacific Relations at the School of Global Policy and Strategy at UC San Diego. He's an expert on the politics of China's physical and financial policies, as well as elite politics of China. He's the author of Factions, Finance in China, and a forthcoming book on coalition formation and the evolution of the Chinese Communist Party. Our second speaker is Professor Barry Naughton, who is the Kwan Chair of Chinese International Affairs, also at the School of Global Policy and Strategy, UC San Diego. He's one of the world's most highly respected economists working on China, and the author of the groundbreaking classic, Growing Out of the Plan, Chinese Economic Reform, 1978 to 1993. I still remember reading this book as a grad student many years ago. He's also the author of the textbook, The Chinese Economy, Transitions and Growth. He now writes a quarterly analysis of the Chinese economy for China Leadership Monitor. Last but not the least, our commentator is our own Bob Brenner, who is a professor emeritus of history and the director of the Center for Social Theory and Comparative History, the organizer of this event. After Bob's comments, I will invite you, the audience, to join the conversation. Please raise your electronic hand and I'll call on you. Okay, so Victor, the floor is yours.
Wonderful. Thank you, CK, and Kevin and Rohan for inviting me to speak. As usual, it's always a great pleasure to speak to our neighbor to the north at UCLA. So I'm just going to present some, very basic statistics about the Chinese communist elite today. So let me just try to go on mode. So, can people see this fine? I think, yeah, we tested this, so it should be okay. And so then you ask, well, why are we looking at the Chinese communist elite particularly? So, in case a few of you don't know, the way in which the Chinese government operates and also, the political system in China, China, has a one-party authoritarian regime, which is governed by one party, which is the Chinese Communist Party. The party currently has 90+ million members. It's not quite 100 million. I think the exact number is something like 97 million members. which is less than 10% of China's population of 1.4 billion people. This organization runs every aspect of China's government and many aspects of China's economy, and Barry can get into that a little bit later on. The party is governed by a powerful elite who mainly sit in the Central Committee. There are a few exceptions. I think there are some very powerful security and military officers who are not in the Central Committee, but nonetheless have a great deal of power. But I would say the vast majority of the power elite, so to speak, in China sit in the Central Committee, or is an alternate member of the Central Committee. Full members of the Central Committee is roughly 200 officials. It fluctuates a little, sometimes a little bit up, sometimes a little bit down between party congresses, which take place once every 5 years. As many of you know, this year, we're in 2022 now. In the fall of this year, we're going to have another party congress, the 20th Party Congress, which is going to elect a new slate of Central Committee members. And in turn, these Central Committee members are going to elect the Politburo, which is a collection of 20 to 30 officials, which is really, really powerful people in China, Vice Premier Xi Jinping himself, and also the Standing Committee of the Politburo, which is a collection of 7 to sort of 11, fluctuates against between different congresses, between 7 to 11 individuals who you can say are the apex of power in China. So, many of you know about this Peng Shuai controversy, her claim of, having a relationship and being assaulted by Zhang Gaoli. Zhang Gaoli, was a vice premier of China, but more importantly, within China, he was in the Politburo Standing Committee, making him one of the, I think at that time, there were 9 Politburo Standing Committee members, one of the 9 most powerful officials in China at that time. And of course, the Central Committee every 5 years also elects the new Secretary General, currently Xi Jinping, and we of course expect him to continue as the Secretary General of the Chinese Communist Party at the Congress this fall. Because the party makes decisions on nearly every major aspect of policies in the country, the makeup of the party elite can tell us something about the priorities, the biases, and the willingness to cooperate on various issues of the Chinese Communist Party itself. And the Chinese Communist Party is the only, real political party in China. So its priorities, its preferences and biases are very important for policy outcomes, for external relations, etc. in China. The analysis below uses a new update of the elite biographical data. Those of you who are familiar with my work, I've been collecting this data since I was in graduate school back sort of 22 years ago. Time flies. Currently we have close to 5,000 officials in the database. The vast majority of officials in the database are Central Committee members, full and alternate members of the Central Committee, as well as provincial Standing Committee members. And actually, some of this data and visualization is available on the website here. So if you want to go online to our China Data Lab web portal on the elite and play around with data, we haven't put all of the data on there. It's mainly just for the 18th and 19th Party Congress. But within a week or two, we are going to put more data online from the 15th Party Congress in 1997 until the 19th Party Congress in 2017. So stay tuned. All right, so what is the makeup of the Chinese power elite in the Central Committee? And here I'm going to do some comparisons between the 15th Party Congress, which took place in 1997, and the 19th Party Congress, the most recent one, which took place in 2017. The share of women who are full Central Committee members rose from 4% to 5% in a 20-year period. and this is China, of course, the second largest economy in the world. It's run by a Marxist-Leninist party, and of course, the goal of Marxism, and Bob can comment on this, as far as I remember, is the liberation of humankind, which of course include the liberation of women, and empowering women, presumably. But in practice, we're not seeing this. This is, if you look across different political systems in the world, authoritarian, democratic, and of course, in authoritarian regimes in general, they tend to have lower representation of women. That, that's a very understudied phenomenon in the literature, and I think people really need to study it. But even among authoritarian regimes, or even among countries whose norms are maybe not so friendly to women, 4 to 5% is really, really low. You have countries like Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Russia, with higher percentage of women in the parliament or whatever collective body of officials these countries would have. In terms of representation of ethnic minorities in China, so as many of you know, Han Chinese is the dominant ethnicity in China, making up, I think, 92%, 91 or 92% of the population. The representation by ethnic minority also is abysmally low in China, although not relative to the share of minorities in the population. Of course, most people would say that, you need to have greater representation of ethnic minorities in the political system, even relative to the population, to give them a voice, because they're already so disadvantaged. But this is not the case in China. So even some pretty, substantial ethnic groups in China, like the Hui, the Mongols, and Uyghurs, of course, they even at the 19th Party Congress, they were represented, by sort of one or two officials in the Central Committee. The Mongols were the most represented, so to speak, ethnic minority, with 3 officials in the Central Committee. And we can get into a whole discussion on this. And basically, the reason why there's this outcome is because the Chinese Communist Party does not take ethnicity mostly into consideration, especially not in recent years. And so that's why most of the sort of minority officials, they tend to be in local government, and they tend never to rise above a certain level. And this is the reason why they are not well represented in the Central Committee. Okay, so what's really interesting is that if you look at the geographical origin of the power elite in China, there also are certain patterns, which is not correlated with the population of various provinces. So if you think about like a political system is completely fair geographically, whichever province has the greatest population would produce the most number of officials. This is not true in China, in the Chinese Communist Party. And this is a pattern that Daniel Koss, who's at Harvard, has done a lot of really interesting work on this. So what it turns out is the case is that in areas that where the Chinese Communist Party had sizable guerrilla-based areas in the 1940s, those are the areas which still have the highest density of Chinese Communist Party members. And because of the high density of Chinese Communist Party members, those are still the areas that produce the greatest number of high-level Chinese government officials. And so these provinces include Shandong, where there was this Jiaodong, base area back in the 30s and the 40s. Jiangsu, well, Shandong and Hebei, so these were like the northern base area. Well, Hebei and Henan. Jiangsu was the new Fourth Army. New Fourth Army had a pretty sizable base area in Jiangsu, and also parts of Zhejiang also. So as a result, you still see clustering of the power elite being born into these relatively small handful of provinces, which tend to neglect the Western provinces and also the Southern provinces. right? So if you look on the right here, in 19th Party Congress, Guangdong, of course, economically, I think the first or the second wealthiest province in China, very high population density, very globalized, internationalized. It is actually very poorly represented in the power elite in the Chinese Communist Party. And I think that will sort of produce a certain kind of policy preferences and biases, right? So on top of the phenomenon that the power elite in the Chinese Communist Party is mainly Han Chinese, male, you also have this geographical concentration in a relatively small handful of provinces and not so well represented across different provinces and regions in China. So this is bad news for our friend Junius Ho, who's a very loyal pro-regime person, but he may not have his day in the Central Committee, unfortunately. Okay, so what is kind of depressing about the Chinese Communist Party is that if you look at the pipeline of officials who are going to rise into powerful positions potentially, and here I'm talking about the cohort of officials born after 1962. So even the oldest among them will turn 60 at the 20th Party Congress, which means that if they have a chance to get into the Politburo, they can serve for another sort of 10 years. And of course, the younger among this group of officials, people who were born after 1970 or so on and so forth, they can serve in the Chinese government for the next 15 years. If you look at the share of women in the post-62 cohort, and here I'm including both Central Committee members, full and alternate, as well as people who are serving in the Provincial Standing Committee, which is sort of one layer below the Central Committee members, the ratio is still quite low compared to the previous cohort. So it's again, a very, very small improvement. So in the among officials who were born after 1952, 7.4% of them were women. In the younger cohort of those born after 1962, still only 8.4% of them were women. And the share of minorities basically stayed the same. There was a slight increase in the education level. And by the way, interestingly, the slight increase in education level was driven primarily by women. So then you're like, how's that possible when women make up such a small percentage of this power elite? And this is what's especially sad about it. The women who make it into the power elite have on average earned an additional degree compared to the male counterparts in order to get into this power elite. Whereas the male counterparts did not need to do that, and they still get in, for whatever reason, other reason. So the slight increase in education level in the power elite in China has been driven by the inclusion of a small handful of very well-educated women in the Central Committee. So the pipeline doesn't look good at all in terms of representation. And we're talking about the next 10 to 15 years. Basically, we're still going to have most likely 10% or less of women in the power elite in the next 10 years, which is very unimaginable at a time when, almost every other country, we can talk about Japan a little bit, is doing a lot in terms of increasing representation, certainly in terms of achieving better gender balance. There's a lot more work to be done in the US, obviously, the European countries, other countries have done better, and also in terms of ethnic minorities. But there's no sign of that in China whatsoever. Okay, so the other thing I want to talk about today is comparing the power strategy, if you will, of Hu Jintao, who was the previous Secretary General of the Chinese Communist Party, with Xi Jinping, who's the current Secretary General, current leader of China. And what I do is I compare the compositions of their faction members at the 17th Party Congress. That was kind of like the mid-tenure Congress for Hu Jintao. and compare that with Xi Jinping's strategy at the 19th Party Congress, which was also his sort of mid-tenure. Although, in the case of Xi, I guess what I'm arguing is that even though the 19th Party Congress took place 5 years after he took power, clearly he did not see it as a mid-tenure Party Congress the way that Hu Jintao saw himself, because Hu Jintao knew that he was going to retire at the 18th Party Congress. That was not the case in the case of Xi Jinping. And so the way that they structured the composition of the factions was just very different. And I outlined some of the differences. So first of all, interestingly, Hu Jintao's faction was much more diverse ethnically, although not in terms of gender balance, very abysmal, just like Xi Jinping. Especially if you included also provincial level officials in his faction. So I'll show you some numbers on that. Second, Xi's faction was much older at the 19th Party Congress than Hu's faction at the 17th Party Congress. This shows or suggests that Xi Jinping had weaker incentives to promote younger faction members with larger elite networks. I'll also show you some numbers on that, into positions of power. So Hu Jintao knew that he would have to retire at the 18th Party Congress. So what he did was he tried to promote as many younger people in his faction as possible into various positions. He cultivated the ones who are politically savvy with larger networks. The reason why he did it was because he wanted post-retirement influence, right? So the younger the people he promotes into positions of power, the longer these young people can serve. And Hu Jintao being their patron, he can retain his post-retirement influence. This was not the case with Xi Jinping at the 19th Party Congress. He promoted older people. He did promote a large number of his followers into the Central Committee, into the Politburo, but they tended to be older officials who would have to retire within the next 5 years or 10 years at the most. And also, he did not cultivate politically savvy politicians with wide networks. And he mainly consolidated power in the party by controlling the security apparatus. So I'll show you some numbers here. So this is very striking, right? So at the 17th Party Congress, Hu Jintao's faction, the average age of that faction was 57 years old. Whereas at the 19th Party Congress, the average age of Xi Jinping's faction members was 62 years old. That's quite a bit older. There's definitely very, very different. The gender balance, as I indicated, basically the same, slightly better in the case of Xi Jinping. Interestingly, Hu Jintao's faction had a lot of ethnic minorities, I would say mainly because he served for a long time in Tibet. And just, the way that we identify factional affiliation is by the officials that you got to know when you served in different places in the past. And because Hu Jintao was in Tibet and Guizhou, where there also are a sizable number of ethnic minorities, the share of minority members in his faction was just higher. Education level, basically the same. Again, because of Hu Jintao's career trajectories, members of his faction also served many more positions in Western and Southwestern China, which tend to be poorer provinces. Okay, so in terms of what jobs the two factions, members of the two factions held at the 17th and 19th Party Congress respectively, you can see that kind of Hu Jintao's factions at the 17th Party Congress mainly clustered in a party and provincial level positions, and no one in the security apparatus, interestingly, but a few more people in the state council. Whereas for Xi Jinping, he devoted a lot of energy into placing trusted supporters in important positions in the security apparatus that we know of. There are a lot of positions in that apparatus that we don't know of course. But if you look at the publicly available ones, Ministry of Public Security, some of the members of the National Security Commission, now also the Internet China Cyberspace Administration. Those all count as security apparatus. Many Xi Jinping followers are controlling these organs. So you can really, this just shows very quickly the rising and falling fortune of the Hu Jintao faction versus the Xi Jinping faction. The transition was the 18th Party Congress. So at the 17th Party Congress, a lot of Hu Jintao followers in the sort of the dotted lines got promoted, both from Provincial Standing Committee into the Central Committee and also Central Committee into alternate Central Committee into full Central Committee members. That completely declined, by the 19th Party Congress. And then you see Xi Jinping's people doing quite well by that time. So I think this is a final kind of graph that I have. This is really interesting. So what you want to pay attention to is the two bars in the middle. The two bars on the left is, basically just a relative size of Xi Jinping's faction at the 19th Party Congress compared to Hu Jintao's faction at the 17th Party Congress. Hu's faction was a little bit smaller, sort of, quite a bit smaller, sort of by more than 10 people in the Central Committee. But what's really interesting is that if you look at the network, the unique network, right? So let's say I am Ching Kwan's client. Ching Kwan's my patron, right? We know a lot of the same people, so that doesn't count. The unique network is the people that I know that Ching Kwan does not know, right? So that's a unique, the size of a unique network. So if you look at the unique network of Hu Jintao followers at the 17th Party Congress was way larger than the unique networks of Xi Jinping followers at the 19th Party Congress. He is not going out of his, that doesn't mean that he's promoting people that have especially weak networks. I mean, I think there are a couple of examples of that. But what I think is happening is that whereas Hu Jintao did deliberately promote people who have had a lot of experience in different provinces and therefore have cultivated a larger network, people like Li Keqiang, there was no such deliberate effort to do so by Xi Jinping at the 19th Party Congress. And the reason, again, is I think because he is looking forward to many more decades of rule, so he doesn't really need to do that to cultivate the next generation, so to speak, because it's going to be quite some time before there's going to be a transition of power. So he's not trying to, and also, if he cultivates someone who's politically very savvy, has a large network, this person may come to challenge his own power the way that Lin Biao did to Chairman Mao's power. And of course, no dictator wants to be in that position. Okay, so some concluding remarks. I think the abysmal diversity in the Central Committee will lead to too much focus on some issues and the neglect of other issues that the majority of population actually cares about. So some of the issues the Chinese government cares a lot about include net export, generating, making sure there's export to the rest of the world, military technology, other kinds of technologies, party history, ideology, infrastructure. But there's very little attention, almost none, on gender equality, on religious freedom, and on the integration of migrant workers into the urban welfare system. I guess a little bit more, and Ching Kwan can correct me if I'm wrong these days. And I think this actually, of course, is kind of a tragic for the people of China, but I think internationally this will have implications too, which is the narrow range of issues that the Chinese government cares about because of poor representation will run up against the interests of other countries, especially the United States. All this military buildup, the technological race is really alarming both parties in the United States and causing all this talk of Cold War and so on and so forth. But imagine if the concerns of the Chinese government was genuinely wider and larger, more inclusive, and include other agendas like gender equality, religious freedom, welfare for all the people of China. And, welfare, we can have a discussion about how real that has been in China. There just would be more room for cooperation and exchanges between China and other countries. So I think this narrow range limits the issue space, if you will, in international affairs also. And then finally, Xi Jinping, as I mentioned, thus far is not preparing a successor generation in large numbers at least. I mean, there are a few people you can say, oh, he's cultivating, Deng Xiaoping or some other people, but not a whole generation of leaders the way that Hu Jintao did. I think this may make future institutionalization of the party even more difficult. Again, thank you for having me, and I look forward to comments from Bob and other people.
Thank you very much, Victor. This is very illuminating and insightful. Again, I think we do not always have this kind of information to look at what's behind the party, who's actually the people behind the party, and the interest and mentality, and so thank you. And let me call on Barry. You have to unmute, Barry.
There we go. Thanks very much, and thank you, CK, for the introduction. This is especially fun for me because I talk to my colleague Victor all the time, but we don't usually get to sort of put our perspectives together and kind of ask, to what extent do they fit together? To what extent do they reinforce each other or contradict each other? And this is a great opportunity to do that. I mean, I'm economist. I focus mainly on economic policy and economic systems issues. But this was especially exciting because in Victor's presentation, not only was it fascinating just in terms of elite dynamics, but he also, in that last screen, he suggested that the social composition of the elite has implications for the kind of policies that the Chinese government focuses on. And so let me take that as my starting point, my sort of springboard, because what I'm going to do is talk about what I see as some of the key, very interesting economic policy developments in the last 10 years or so, basically, pretty much since Xi Jinping came to power. And I think I'm probably not giving anything away when I say, to my mind, even though this is a kind of a broader picture than I usually look at these policy issues, to my mind, the answer is absolutely. There's no question that some of the really distinctive and in some ways very surprising economic policy outcomes can be linked pretty clearly to the social composition of the Chinese Communist Party elite, because that Chinese Communist Party elite is predominantly urban, highly educated, obviously party members, connected, as Victor said, to cities in the north, and they have you can very rarely see cases where the interests of that group aren't an important consideration. And you can often see cases in the development of economic policy that would otherwise be rather surprising. And so I'm going to also put on a PowerPoint, and I will show some slides, and some of them might be a little too detailed. I'll kind of flick through some of them relatively quickly, but I think the basic argument will be pretty clear. And I don't know, the title of this session is supposed to be, "Where's China heading?" I have to say, I'm going to start off by saying I don't know where China is heading, because I feel that the policies that Xi Jinping are putting forward have, almost certainly got a fairly high degree of support and buy-in in the short run, but that they also are really unsettling for many, many people, even in this, highly educated urban elite party member group. So really what I'm talking about is not so much real speculations about where China is heading, but rather some efforts to trace some of the most distinctive features of the policy trajectory under Xi Jinping. And I want to focus on essentially three areas. I'm going to argue that there are three very important policy outcomes. These are the kind of things I talk about in my Economy of China class. I mean, they're not selected intentionally by me to illustrate any kind of political argument or any kind of argument about the social composition of the Chinese elite. But in fact, I think it's a relatively good selection of issues that does seem to demonstrate that there's a strong link between who the party serves and who the party represents and the kind of policy outcomes that we see. So the first, maybe this is a case in some sense, but it's a broad policy arena. So when we take a look at China's, and I'm kind of combining two things that are closely related here, but they're often put together, which is the fiscal system and the welfare system. And without going into too much depth, I just want to say that up until about 5 years ago, so up until the real, the Xi Jinping administration really kind of put their stamp on the overall policy environment. Up until that time, China had been engaged in a pretty serious effort and a pretty coherent and a pretty sustained effort to rebuild and generalize a kind of social welfare system. And this effort had really, 4 planks that were pretty consistently followed. First was just to make sure that welfare and health and education institutions in the countryside, many of which had eroded and even sometimes collapsed during the economic reform period of the 80s and 90s. First of all, just creating an institutional framework so that they could be rebuilt, then gradually increasing the funding available so that the rural people would have some kind of institutional counterpart to the relatively generous welfare system of the cities, then reform the household registration system, the hukou system, to make it less of an obstacle for people moving into the city, and thus creating conditions for the gradual unification of health, education, and welfare systems. And this also required setting up a kind of urban, less formal and less generous system that people who were in cities, and this obviously included migrants, but it also typically included other people who lived in cities and who weren't part of the migrant community for whatever reason they were not qualified to the more generous urban programs. So this made a lot of sense, and you could trace this from 2002, certainly when Wen Jiabao started to really work on reviving rural institutions, and you can trace it up until the early years of Xi Jinping. And now today, to a remarkable extent, this whole program has kind of run out of steam. It hasn't been rejected, of course, but it's no longer something where we would see steady progress. For about a decade after 2002, we saw steady progress. For instance, this is budgetary spending on education. Of course, Chinese households spend lots on education, but from 2002 to 2012, there was a steady increase in the share of GDP going to education. After 2012, flattens out, declines slightly. So the fiscal effort for education after this important recovery then sort of stalls out. There are also very serious issues about how appropriately funds are allocated. And I think in particular, many people in the audience will be familiar with Scott Rozell's recent book, great book. And, he simply says, look, the lost opportunity to invest in basic level human capital in the countryside is enormous, while at the same time, there's probably overinvestment in higher education in the cities. So it's quite clear who the educational system serves in China is consistent with Victor's speculation. And that makes society more unequal. A similar thing is to look at the pension systems. You know, Wen Jiabao should get some credit for bringing about the creation of a much less generous pension system that could cover some people in the countryside and those uncovered urban people. So we've got two systems now. That's a step forward. But look how little progress there's been in terms of actually funding that second system. It's hard to get a good summary indicator, but one is just you take the outlays of the entire system, divide by the number of people enrolled in that system. For the well-funded urban system, it's 11,000 renminbi per person. For the secondary system, it's 583. Now, of course, this is not precise. There are differences in the age, composition, and other things, but still, to get an almost 20-to-1 differential, he shows we're still on a two-track kind of system. And this is super important because the urban system is so generous that it's really not sustainable, right? You've got a system in China where the system's already in deficit. I mean, people know that China is an aging society. So obviously funding the pension system long-term is a big problem long-term. But wait a minute, we're not even talking about the long-term. China is not an aged society, it's an aging society. And yet the urban pension system has very high contribution rates, and yet it's not self-supporting. And people, you know, retire at 60. Many people retire before that. Males, 55 for females. U.S. has a 5-year life expectancy gap. You know, I mean, advantage. People in the U.S. on average live about 5 years longer than people in China's cities. But you have to be 67 in the United States to get full access to Social Security contributions. So the pension system is a good indicator of a system that serves urban people, and especially the relatively skilled urban people who hold the administrative, educational, managerial jobs, works very well for them, very costly, can't possibly be extended to the rest of the country. It's just too expensive. But of course, the urban residents like it, and they strongly resist even relatively modest efforts to increase retirement ages, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And lying behind a lot of this difficulty is, I think, the simple fact that, you know, 10 years ago, China seemed to be making a serious effort to dissolve the household registration barriers, get rid of the hukou system, and make most of the rural to urban migrants into permanent urban residents. You can see the outcome. I mean, so in this graph, this is normalized by China's total population. The blue line is simply all the people who live in cities, and the red line is people who have registered urban household registration permits, or urban hukou. And what you can see is, okay, in 2014, they did shift the way numbers were reported, but this was also the beginning of a period where they were supposed to shrink the number of rural people in urban areas without urban household registrations by 100 million. And you can kind of eyeball this and see it never happened, did it? There's been no significant reduction. In fact, actually a small increase in the share of China's overall population that's in cities without urban hukou registration. And it's not that there's a lack of resources overall. I mean, it is true that fiscal revenues peaked in 2015 and have been declining. Again, this is as a share of GDP since. So there's some really interesting issues here. And of course, they're also hard to parse out because COVID has a big impact. COVID causes Social Security premiums to be exempted for a year in 2020. That's why they fall. And we see this shift to dependence on land revenues, which is a money-making proposition for urban governments. So that when we put all these things together, we see revenues continue to increase as a share of GDP to 2018 and then decline. But as I say, again, this could be a COVID-related phenomenon. But in other words, the key point is the fiscal impact is still big and until very, very recently growing, but the ability to adapt the fiscal system to really meet these ambitious social goals that were laid out a decade ago has almost completely failed. And that's really puzzling. Fiscal reforms were laid out in 2013, 2014. And many, many people led by the Minister of Finance, Lo Jiwei, said, this is what we're going to do. We have a 3-stage reform of the fiscal system that's going to allow it to adapt to these new social needs. He said, step 1 will play out in 2014, step 2 in 2015, step 3 in 2016. And what happened was the first stage was adopted, but the more radical and more important second and third stages just evaporated. And it happened, I was in China in summer of 2014 interviewing with a number of economic officials. Everybody agreed, yes, we've got a new wave of reforms. Fiscal reforms are going first. There's a leadership consensus. It's been decided, no issues. And it never happened. Why? We don't know. Similarly, this failure to overcome the dualistic social structure. So it's not just that urban and non-urban household registrations remain, but also that efforts to get rural migrants in the cities, get their children enrolled in urban education and the good, fair educational system have also not been very impressive in recent years. And all the other efforts to rationalize the system have stalled out. So we see this very strong, peculiar, and difficult to explain outcome, which is that completely feasible, but admittedly difficult reforms that China has been carrying out for decades seem to have stalled out in the last 10 years when they really started to impinge upon the interests of the urban, I don't necessarily want to call it the urban elite because we're talking about a much larger group. We're talking about, hundreds of millions of people, but that relatively privileged section of the Chinese society, which is in the relatively well-off urban middle classes. So the second policy area, and this is really the focus of my own personal research, has been the intensification of industrial policy and, in a broader sense, planning over especially the last, say, 5 years. I mean, as I think everybody is aware, starting in about 2006, China started to engage in a pretty comprehensive effort of industrial policy, locating sectors, so-called strategic emerging industries, where they felt Chinese firms would have a good opportunity on the global market over the next coming decades, strategic emerging industries in particular, because they were designated as sectors where there weren't strong entrenched incumbents, right? So electric vehicles, arguably bigger opportunity than gas-powered vehicles, because in gas-powered vehicles, you've got formidable Toyota and Volkswagen, but in electric vehicles, of course, this is before Tesla even, but even today, lots of room at the top, as it were, for the people who move first into electric vehicles. So, so China definitely started this industrial policy push but with a commitment to looking for international markets, with a commitment to layering industrial policy on top of a market economy. And what we've seen in the last several years is this program become much more plan-like, right? First of all, definitely the expansion of it. We can't track it very well because there's so many different channels, but it's pretty clear that the effort is increased dramatically. But I also want to point out three dimensions in which qualitatively the nature of that industrial policy push has changed. First, it's more plan-like. Now, part of this is because there's more land use planning and more infrastructure planning. A lot of the new technologies that we're dealing with today have a strong link to so-called smart infrastructure. Smart cities, you put sensors, you put different kinds of signals, you have massive collection of data, and you use AI tools and machine learning to process that data that's coming in from these different sectors. So there's more land use planning. There's more regional planning as cities are called on to create more and more sort of high-tech zones and satellite cities and everything that fit together. And of course, this is also, merged with an effort that seems to be pretty closely associated with Xi Jinping himself to create urban clusters and deconcentrate the centers of big mega cities like Beijing and Shanghai, and to a certain extent, Hong Kong and Guangzhou. So as the industrial and technological policy combines with regional land use and infrastructure policy, and different regions have their initiatives, well, at a certain point, if you give more and more importance to each of these, at a certain point, you almost have to say, well, let's have a governing overall plan that these component plans are part of. And look at this, you're pushing the system as a whole towards a top-down planned vision. And sure enough, there's a December 2018 document on planning coordination in the hierarchy of plans that essentially says, hey, we have to do a better job of subordinating local plans and different types of plans to this overall aggregate vision of where the economy is going. So industrial policy that started off as opportunistic and fragmentary has increasingly been integrated into a broader, unified planning process. Since the last couple of years, there's also been, although there's still all kinds of ways in which China is committed to global markets, but industrial policy increasingly is dedicated to making China self-sufficient and to a certain extent insulated from, obviously, not just the world market, but of course, potential sanctions from the United States. So we can certainly see this as, in some ways, it's a completely expected response to American policies. And then, then you can keep going infinite regress if you want. In some sense, American policies are a completely expected response to earlier Chinese policies. But in any case, however you allocate blame or responsibility, clearly China has pushed its industrial policy strongly in a direction where the objective is self-sufficiency. So in the 14th five-year plan, you have the objective of science and technology self-sufficiency as one of the primary goals of the plan. And in a more concrete fashion, you see a very intensive effort to replace global cross-border high technology supply chains with a self-reliant national set of suppliers that involves specifically subsidizing firms to to the best of their ability, be ready to step in and plug the gaps in these supply chains if and when foreign supplies, which means American supplies, are cut off. And similarly, to identify sources where China has the ability to pressure and influence others because of their own dominance of certain links in the supply chain. So this is very different. We never saw this before 3 or 4 years ago. Maybe implicitly, of course, China's always said, oh, we need to control these core technologies. But now the definition of that has spread to include we need to be able to control whole production chains that previously have relied on international coordination and cooperation. And third, of course, we've seen a huge change in the last year in the role of private companies in China's industrial policy. I mean, it was always the case, at least to we outside observers, that one of the strengths of China's industrial policy was that it fully accepted the success of China's private firms as being one of the objectives of industrial policy. In other words, private firms were national champions. Not only were they acceptable national champions, they were in some ways the exemplary national champions. I mean, China, yes, has some big high-tech state-owned enterprises. Some of them have very significant capabilities, but they're often directly tied to specific government projects like the space program or military procurement, and they don't necessarily have that much presence in global markets outside of those markets they're driven by government demands. But Alibaba did, and Huawei did, and Baidu did to a certain extent. So in some ways, the private firms were the most prominent national champions that China had, and some of the most successful firms that they had. Now, all of a sudden, after the summer of 2021, that's completely in question. And I'll come back to this a bit near the end, but certainly the Chinese government is sending a strong message to private firms that it is no longer the case that they set their expansion plans and the Chinese government comes in behind them to support them. And it is now the new normal is that the Chinese government defines the boundaries within which these private firms operate, and they have to adapt to the opportunities and the limits that the Chinese government lays out. So to me, in a way, it's very, very striking because 5 years ago, it was quite proper, I think, to characterize the Chinese government as a venture capital state, meaning it was basically a market economy, but the Chinese government was putting in capital, was putting in advantageous conditions that pretty much applied to any firm, where what the government wanted was development of high-tech industry. And it would support many different projects to do that, but it was at least reasonably even-handed. It would support, whatever business looked like it was likely to succeed. And now I don't think you could characterize the system in that way. So then we come to the third kind of surprising policy development, which is so-called common prosperity. As I'm sure everybody on this seminar knows, common prosperity was a slogan, a traditional slogan that Xi Jinping resurrected and highlighted over the summer. But the actual instruments used to measure, to advance this idea of common prosperity have been highly politicized and, from an economist standpoint, grossly inefficient. I mean, the most prominent actual measures of common prosperity have been Here, so you can see some quotes on the screen. Reasonably adjusting excess incomes. So in other words, they're targeted at rich people. Encouraging high-income individuals and businesses to give back more to society, and floating this interesting term, tertiary redistribution, meaning there's income distribution and taxes create a secondary distribution, and tertiary distribution essentially means charitable giving, or we could also say extra legal exactions on wealthy people. It's not hard, I don't think, to explain the timing of this or the strong political motivation. It's clearly sort of part of Xi Jinping's build up to the 20th Party Congress. He wants to be seen as putting forward some kind of inclusive agenda, but it's hard to see that it's going to do much good. And really the fundamental reason why it's hard to be optimistic about this program is it's almost complete neglect of fiscal and tax instruments in an effort to achieve greater income inequality. I mean, this is something where we have experience from, scores or even hundreds of countries around the world. And I think, one of the most robust generalizations you could possibly make is tax policy is what works in terms of reducing income inequality. Even in the United States, which is hardly an exemplar of redistributive policy, the Gini coefficient pre-tax is 0.53. It's reduced to 0.4 after tax, and government transfers are taken into account. So, that's what works. And it's not just the United States, it's virtually every developed country. These are OECD figures. Whereas China's tax system does virtually nothing to redistribute income. And, one glaring element is, right, capital gains and inheritance are not taxed in China. So basically rich people escape taxation. Property tax reforms were announced, but seem already to have been kind of taken away, at least in one or two examples. So we see this puzzle, which is Xi Jinping announces this program of common prosperity, but then almost immediately fails to announce or introduce or even pilot any of the crucial tax and fiscal policies that would be necessary to make it a reality. Instead, what do we get? We get this sustained campaign against private business owners that seems to indicate some kind of behind the scenes sort of, 1 to 2% ownership stake being given to government-linked charitable organizations or something like that. I mean, I think in the next year or so, we'll have a stronger sense of what's exactly driving it. But just to give some examples that are completely typical, Liu Xiaodong, the CEO of JD.com, just agreed to transfer $2.3 billion worth of stock to a government corporation. It's about, I'm sorry, not corporation, a government, non-governmental organization, a government-linked charity. That's about 2% of the value of JD.com. And there's a speech that Ma Huatong, the CEO of Tencent, gave to his employees, not confirmed 100%, but certainly widely disseminated on Chinese social media, where he's telling the employees, look, we have to acknowledge that we are replaceable. We are not unique, we are replaceable. And the important thing is for us to fulfill our role exactly without overplaying or underplaying what is expected of us. So clearly, private elites are being demoted to a subordinate position within the Chinese elite. So those are some of the striking economic policy outcomes. And I think, an interesting thing for us to discuss here is to what extent do we understand these as being the concomitants of exactly that kind of the social background of the ruling Communist Party that Victor just described for us. And I think really you can't look at these policy outcomes without at least having the suspicion that these outcomes make no sense unless you see them in part as a particular sensitivity to the views and interests of the urban educated elite that's represented by the Communist Party. Thanks a lot. I'll stop there.
Great, wonderful. Thank you, Barry. Given us lots of things to think about and discuss in a minute. But first of all, Bob, your comments, please. You have to unmute. Yes.
I'm in a bit of trouble. My printer broke down, and I'm kind of between a text that I can see and the text that I need from the printer. But I'll do my best. And I mean, they're very rich presentations. So I think what is needed from me is fortunately less than might appear, given that I'm supposed to be a discussant. So let's see. I think maybe the theme that I think both Barry and Victor emphasized, and I think both were explicit about it, especially Barry, was that, and I hope I haven't misunderstood, that in a way, what we've had in recent years in China is quite different from what we might have expected from the standpoint of the early 21st century, or even the standpoint of the financial crisis of 2008. There's been and I hope I haven't misunderstood this, there has been an inward-looking trend that perhaps is built around and I'd kind of like both Victor and Barry to kind of maybe just repeat this or emphasize that. It appears that the Chinese elite no longer, at a certain point, lost essentially the confidence in their initial, in what had been almost, quite a long period of sort of outward-looking, growing expectation of growing success, growing power. So if we looked at the first decade, looking at taking a background of what Barry and Victor are talking about, if we're looking at the Chinese development in the first decade of the 21st century, China appeared to be following an inexorable trend toward a greater place in the world economy and in turn world power. And at that point, it was also the case, maybe surprisingly, that from the standpoint of the United States, this was not seen as problematic, but to be welcomed. And the late 20th century, early 21st century, in formal terms, the US was making a place for a growing and a growingly successful economically China. And, you know, I think part of the subtext was US firms in ever greater involvement there, although that was always, how that was going to take place was never quite clear beyond the sphere of finance, where I think it has taken place. Anyway, so there was this dynamic Chinese economy, and the first decade, I think, of the 21st century only confirmed and exacerbated certain existing trends. Huge, and that was, as elsewhere in East Asia, not only the domestic growth, but a success in exports that allowed for export surpluses, that allowed for investment to take place easily and cheaply. So there was a kind of interconnection between the success at a world scale and domestic development. But soon you got about 2008, 2009, the world crisis, and and in retrospect, I guess a question that I would like to put to both Barry and sorry, to both Barry and Victor, is to look back, to maybe take a look back at that world crisis of 2008-9 and see if it is how they would evaluate it, whether it has kind of been the turning point that it looked like at the time, and it seems to be that. It seems to be that from the take I have on this, that is where essentially a huge shift took place. And in a sense, there's been a perpetual pressure to adjust to that. Okay, so you have that world crisis. At first, I think the Chinese feel confident to be able to continue as they had been. They carried out the world's greatest Keynesian stimulus, gigantic demand management wave, nothing like it before. But the problem was that after a couple of years, even though they were very well placed in terms of their own surpluses to finance and support that, by 2012, it had, in a sense, reached its limit and, in a sense, shipwrecked. And the essentially, since that failure, you could look at what's going on in China as attempts to develop a new path, you know, that takes into account much slower growth of the world economy, much greater intensification of competition, much slower growth of markets. Still, the Chinese were able to, and looked like they were able to continue to do that a lot better than anyone else. Their growth, growth was far greater than anywhere in the West, so to say, in the West. And indeed, if you know, at the time of Davos in 2017, when Shih spoke, he said it's time for us to take center stage and to kind of complete the thing, complete the process. But I guess what I would want to, I guess I would want to put the question to Barry and Victor, see if I understood what they were saying. It seems like what has happened since then is that it corresponds in a large part to the pandemic, but it doesn't seem to. It seems to me that that while that is the superficial catalyst, something much deeper is happening. That is, initially, you know, there's the response to the pandemic is very tight, very disciplined, and going to have consequences for much more domestically oriented, much slower growth. But that has, in a sense, takes on a life of its own. And I wonder if I am mischaracterizing Barry and Victor, trying to actually say what they're saying, but maybe I'm misunderstanding it. It seems that at least from that time, probably a bit earlier, you're getting a more general response that is more, that, you know, could be said to have been catalyzed by the pandemic, but is essentially turning inward to decrease Chinese, to increase Chinese self, you know, autonomy, self-dependence, if you will. The opposite of globalization, if you will. The term dual circulation is bandied about. I think it's it's Shih's term. Should be working for Chinese companies rather than in multinationals. Production should be aimed domestically rather than externally. Import substitution is the name of the game. And at the same time, the kind of I don't know, dramatic, dynamic, the most dynamic sphere in the Chinese economy, maybe by just what's left, the slowdown in the world economy, the slowdown in world industry, is in the property sector, and it seems as if what has happened recently at the heart of this inward-looking turn, conservative turn to self subsistence, and therefore a lack of dependence on the world success of the economy is you know, is this, as I said, is this cutting back. It seems as if the this goes along with a more general backing off from the, I think this is what I think what Barry was emphasizing, the last part of what he said, is a backing off of the creation of national champions by the state, essentially backing the most dynamic local productive businesses in all the familiar ways of the East Asian model, so to speak, and a subordination of the private sector to the public sector, so to speak, an emphasis on planning, technological self-sufficiency, reliance on local supply chains. So you're moving in the direction of statism rather than toward, you know, an ever more ebullient private capitalism supported by the state, which is what I think was the expected direction in through first 10, even 15 years of the 21st century. So I guess the I'll end with a couple comments on what might have been, what is behind this. In part, if I understood them, what Barry and Victor were emphasizing was were international factors of a political sort that they expected hostility, enmity, especially from the United States, the US organizing, you know, as Biden confirmed, so to speak, the U.S. allies in hostility to China.
Bob, sorry, your time is up.
Okay,
can I ask you to sort of wrap up quickly?
Yeah, I'll wrap up with in just a couple sentences. So so that was in part the inward turn is in part a response to expectations of international hostility, but I think the other side of it is something that's going on everywhere, which has to do with the huge slowdown in the world economy for the last decade, which China has had to accede to. It's no longer the most dynamic growth center. It's accepted a slower growth that can be domestically founded rather than internationally dependent. So both the world diplomatic pressures, especially coming from the US and its allies, but also a slowdown in the world economy have been, are the ultimate sources of this inward turning. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. We have still 100 people in the room. So what I like to propose is that people who have questions, please raise your electronic hand. I already have one person who raised his hand quite a while ago. And then we'll take a few questions at the same time. And Victor and Barry could then respond to both Bob and our audience questions. Okay, so first, Bert Hoffman. Can you unmute, please?
Yes, I was muted. I was also muted on the chat. So Kevin asked me a question on the chat, but I'm sorry I couldn't answer. So my questions, and thank you so much for Barry and Victor for this great exposition. But I'd like you both to speculate going forward, because you spoke largely about the past and where we are. Now there's something happening in the fall, the 20th Party Congress. Victor, what's going to change in the politics? I was actually surprised that she was not much more dominant in all of the gremia of power. And so could you speculate what's happening? Barry, we've seen before that terms like common prosperity pop up, and then for a while they linger and they're not really clear where this is going. And then suddenly there's a number of measures. Do you expect something similar, or is this really just playing towards the ears of the urban middle class and basically an election campaign with unfulfilled promises? Or are we going to see major action after the 20-party Congress? Thanks.
Great, thank you. And we have another hand, Sanjay Buparalia. Hi, Sanjay.
Hi, CK. Thanks. Thanks for two great presentations. One question was for Victor. You concluded by saying that we're likely to see a greater focus on exports, military technology, party history, etc., compared to other issues. And I was wondering, CK at the beginning talked about how she wanted to relate, or how the panel might relate Xi's agency to wider social forces. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about that. I mean, you charted in this amazing way the composition of the Central Committee, but in a sense, how much of that is she directing or appointing these people, and how much are these new priorities reflecting these larger forces? I was very struck you didn't mention class or occupation or backgrounds in the Central Committee sociology, and that would be interesting. And for Barry, it was really fascinating to listen to your analysis, and I was wondering, how do we explain that or understand that, given that when Xi Jinping first came in, there was a lot of attention to the idea that he was going to take Hu Jintao's agenda of cracking down on inequality and corruption and intensify it. But then, as you showed so acutely, that there's no tax reform, there has been a neglect of further welfare reform, which would seem to undermine that whole purpose. And so it's puzzling, even at a larger strategic level. I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about that. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Sanjay. And while we're waiting for perhaps other hands to be raised, I also have some, since Sanjay mentioned this question, I also have questions for both Victor and Barry, because Barry mentions that, these policy changes reflect sort of Xi's regime serving an urban elite, the interest of the urban elite. And if I combine this comment with Victor's presentation, I find myself still asking, what exactly is this urban elite and their interest? Because it seems like, as I said, in the beginning, that I don't think Xi himself could pull this off. He must be driven. There's something larger behind him. And what kind of interest is supportive of his policies? And so the party bosses, which economic sector, let's say? Obviously the IT people, they are part of the urban elite, but Xi has no qualm in cracking down. So to just lump everything together as an urban elite interest that this regime is serving or being supported by seems to be a little bit too broad. And if we could narrow it down to, like, economically, who are they? Who are the people, the interested parties here behind the party? And the second question I have is about self-sufficiency, an internal looking kind of Chinese economy going internal, more internally inward looking. I was wondering whether between the more globalized China that Bob was referring to, and we all sort of see after 2008, before 2008, and even after, between the globalized Chinese economy or China version and self-sufficiency that Xi seems to be sort of pointing to. I wonder if there is a third position that is being formed right now, which is the relationship between Russia and China, and not just these two giant autocrats, but also I think there are like 5 Central Asian countries that they're forming together as a financial bloc, where some people said that they're trying to get away from the US dollar-centered international financial system, create their own kind of regional financial system, which means that China is not like closed off from the rest of the world, but is building its own kind of communist or a new version of the communist bloc, where they could trade among themselves and delinked from the US dominated kind of global Western system. But China doesn't necessarily fall back on an internal looking kind of economy. And when you combine that with China in Africa and all these third world countries that China has been building all sorts of ties with. So I'm imagining whether there will be this alternative world where we are not decoupled from each other, but just new blocks of economic power forming. Okay, so since I'm not seeing other hands, are there other hands? Well, you can rate. Okay, Daniel Lin, could you unmute, please?
Hi, thank you so much, everyone, for, I guess, the presentation. I think there was a lot of good information out there. I think my question particularly is regarding Victor's presentation, specifically regarding sort of this conversation about the composition of sort of the, I guess, the Politburo, or just the larger, I guess, Central Committee, right? I think part of the thing that I'm thinking about is that, for example, in the US, there is sort of a population or a populace-based demand for why we have certain levels of representation, whether it be gender identity, sexual orientation, or whatever it be, to have sort of a composition that reflects sort of what the people would also like to see in their government. But I'm wondering how much of this sort of limit, like, or how much of this gender imbalance or these ethnic minority imbalances within, I guess, within the current composition is sort of induced purely based on structure, or is there even a critical mass of concern within the general population about the fact that there should be a more representative sort of composition in government? Like, I guess my question here is there even, a social demand for this type of representation, or is it just something that we are more concerned about because we're sort of looking at this from a more academic perspective, right? That's my question. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you. So we have still 25 minutes, so maybe we can go back to the two speakers for some feedback responses, and then if there are other questions, we'll go for a second round of Q&A. Victor or Barry, who wants to go first?
Oh, okay. Yeah, so I'll go very quickly before Barry here. So going back to Bob's very interesting observations. I mean, you know, as we've talked extensively about this before, I do think that 2008, 2009 laid the groundwork for China feeling very confident about its own economic status vis-a-vis the United States. Although what I have to say about that is that, well, so that has kind of two effects. One is that a lot of the financial experts, especially the people that I know the best about probably, did take 2008, 2009 as kind of the beginning of the end of US global dominance in the financial sphere. And that was around the time when this big push for the renminbi internationalization also sort of began, you know, as CK pointed out. But so that has an effect. One is that I think Xi Jinping then took power a few years after that, late 2012. That influenced his thinking, you know. So I think, you know, if someone else has taken power, probably this more passive foreign policy would have persisted. But maybe, you know, on the margin, there would be more self-confidence in Chinese external behavior. But Xi Jinping, you know, probably has a lot of his own personal biases or preferences for a more aggressive kind of foreign policy. And what happened in the United States in 2008, 2009 really gave him the confidence to really go for it. he almost immediately launched the One Belt, One Road initiative, which saw the disbursement of hundreds of billions of dollars to developing countries around the world, but especially on China's periphery in Central Asia and so on and so forth. But China also had its own reversal, which was 2015. So people don't talk about it a lot these days, but in 2015, China lost $1 trillion from its foreign exchange reserve. Stock market sort of collapsed, required massive POC intervention. China was on the verge of a financial crisis in 2015. And ultimately, very draconian capital control, which is still with China today, managed to extinguish the outflow pressure, but it was not an easy thing. It was actually extremely difficult. China's foreign exchange reserve lost $1 trillion. Also, after that, we saw some modification of the One Belt, One Road initiative. We don't see China lending, tens of billions of dollars to countries anymore, which was the case back in sort of 2014, 2015. We still see financing to the tunes of billions of dollars, but China is a lot more selective. So this gets at, CK's question also. So I think, of course, the technocrats in China, they always talk about this renminbi zone and so on and so forth. But at the end of the day, the problem with a renminbi zone is that in order to have a renminbi zone, you would have to have a large amount of renminbi circulating outside of mainland China. And when you have what we call liquidity, which is just the amount of money circulating, that allows people to short the currency also, right? So liquidity is conditioned for shorting the currency. So basically, you can imagine, let's say you say, oh, we're gonna give Kazakhstan all this renminbi, they can spend it. And then Kazakhstan immediately takes the billions of renminbi they were given, go to Hong Kong or London, exchange it for US dollars because the Kazakh, oligarchs would like to buy houses in Miami or whatever. Then the PBOC would have to come in and buy up this excess renminbi that the Kazakhs has sold in Hong Kong or London, or the value of the renminbi will start to collapse, right? So the more, the larger the renminbi zone is, let's say there is one, the more the People's Bank of China would have to come to the defense of these other countries that are using the renminbi. And that's actually a big liability to China. So this is why, well, then you're like, well, why isn't this a problem for the US? Well, it's not a problem for the US because the US is the biggest borrower in the dollar by far. And so we are free riding in the rest of the world. So China is not doing that. China, in a sense, has no one to free ride on, because all the countries that China is trying to include in the renminbi zone, they're trying to free ride on China. So that creates a kind of a situation. In terms of the pandemic, Bob also mentioned, it's making China more autarkic. But at the end of the day, China, I think Barry can correct me if I'm wrong, I think export is still incredibly important for China's economic strategy. So it can't possibly cut itself off from the rest of the world. Very quickly on a couple of elite politics questions, Bert's question on 20th Party Congress. Xi is staying in power. I think as I mentioned in the Singapore conference, which you hosted, I think the biggest kind of elite politics question for the 20th Party Congress is whether senior officials in Xi Jinping's generation, many of whom should retire according to existing norms, whether those people are going to retire, right? And if not, because right now you can see the age structure of his faction, and as I showed, on average, they're 62 years old. So if they're not in the Politburo, they should retire. Many of them should retire, when they reach the age of 65. Even among the people who are in the Politburo, many of them are reaching, 68, which or more or older, which according to previous norms, they should retire. But if it turns out that a lot of these people stay on, then it signals, an aging of the Chinese elite, kind of, I would say, similar to the late Soviet period. And I think that will have a lot of repercussions. So Sanjay and CK has a question about the sort of social composition of the elite. Why is it so male dominated? And, I think we would guess urban dominated. Yeah, so that's a very interesting question, and I would like to do more work on it. The problem is we don't have a lot of data on the pool of junior officials at the county or below level. So once I'm talking to some people at Harvard, they might have the database. Like once we can trace entire cohorts through their entire careers, then we can see where the gender discrimination has the worst effect. So it can either come about from the beginning, with party recruitment, which actually has gotten better, right? So 45% of new party members are women, which is still not great, but better than, I think it used to be 30% or something like that. But clearly there's some problems in terms of their promotion. Either they're specializing in positions that are not conducive to promotion, or even when they're specializing in good jobs, they're not getting promoted because of outright, gender discrimination. In terms of other social traits, provincial officials, because there are so many positions in the provincial and local governments, that's still the largest channel for upward promotion. Although Xi Jinping has prioritized SOE managers again. The finance people who were favored during the Zhongji period, they are now neglected. So you don't see a lot of financiers getting to the higher level, but some of the technology SOEs, especially their managers, are getting ahead, into provincial governor, party secretary position. Oh, and also the new Xinjiang party secretary, who is almost certainly going to be a Politburo member, Ma Xingrui, worked for an aeronautical SOE for many years. So that's a kind of a new pattern. And then Daniel Lin's, very quickly, popular demand for representation. You're right, that is the problem with authoritarian regimes. There's no popular demand or input on policies or representation. But historically, obviously this being a communist party, there was a lot of discussion of having ethnic and gender representation, because that was one of the earlier aims of Marxist movements around the world. But, I guess, that did not become a high priority in the end.
Larry?
Yeah, thanks a lot, guys. So many interesting and big questions. I mean, let me start with a couple of mea culpas. I mean, CK pointed out that, my use of the, social background of the regime is way too sloppy, and I completely agree. I mean, this is I'm stepping outside my area of expertise, and I'm using terms that are a little bit embarrassing from a sort of sociological and political standpoint. But I think the justification would be to say there's this broad sense in which a set of easily identified very large urban groups that are sort of, as big as classes, even though it's kind of terrifying how China talks about this revival of Marxism within China and yet manages to never mention class, right? But I guess we could make one, I think, slightly more precise observation, which is that Xi Jinping came into this situation where urban interests were already sort of overrepresented within the CCP system. And he then both respected that, but then laid on his own far more individual and, in my view, sort of archaic and slightly, I don't know what the right adjectives are, but he certainly took this in a direction that was much more personalized and much more distinctive than I think any of us expected. And so Sanjay asked an interesting question about, what Xi intended when he came in. But one of the things we can see for sure is that Xi purposely misrepresented his intentions when he first came to power. I mean, he made a comment to Li Rui on his deathbed about how, some of us agree with you, but we can't speak out, because we're, all these were clearly designed to convince other parts of the Chinese elite that Xi was more of a reformer than he really was, and to disguise his own intentions. So I think for all these reasons, I at least feel completely defeated by the question, what specific interests support Xi's policies and what specific sectors. I mean, we can clearly see that after summer 2021, Xi's long-term belief that state enterprises are treasured members of the national team means something much more than we might have thought at first, that he really genuinely privileges these people as the front ranks of the national elite. And Victor gave a great example with the new Xinjiang head. So I think that's the best we can do. But what we can say is, even in his very personalized package of policies, Xi has been very gentle towards this broader urban group. I mean, there's a reason that they sort of like him. I mean, he's not putting taxes on their houses. He's not, letting the unwashed rural migrants into the cities. He's not doing things that challenge them, and so they're reasonably happy with his actions so far. I think, as Victor noted, and as a number of people, who will be pointing out, yeah, we don't want to overstate the sense of self-sufficiency. Clearly, Xi Jinping thinks he can have it both ways, that he can manage international flows much more tightly than any of his predecessors, be more secure, but still be very, in his terms, open, even though I think we can predict there'll be more and more friction about this. So, Chinese exports grew really fast last year. That's not what dual circulation was about at all. So they were surprised too. Everybody was surprised. And China's weight in the world has increased. It's gone into RCEP, this big free trade agreement. They seem to have more and more confidence of their ability to manage international economic transactions to give them more and more power. I think the finance thing is a more desperation thing. They're really worried about U.S. financial sanctions, so they're looking for back channels. I don't think that's ever going to be a separate block. It's really just an attempt to have something as a fallback in case of necessity. And so I guess the last thing is Bert's great question. Is really an observation that I totally agree with, which is there have been many times in the past where we criticized Chinese economic policy and we said, well, they've done lots of things well, but it seems that they can't do this. And I think he probably hears echoes of that in what I said, that they're doing all these things, but they can't get the fiscal system right. And there is a possibility that even as we speak, there'll be these conversations going on behind the scenes and analysis behind the scenes that gradually puts together a policy coalition that could push it through. That has been the experience of the past. I don't see that happening in this case, but I don't think we should exclude it either. So thanks a lot.
We have another question. Lex Von Clark, can you unmute?
Hi there. I'm really excited to be here. Thank you guys so much for putting this on. My question is about something that wasn't particularly mentioned through any of the presentations. So if it's outside the purview of the conversation, I totally understand. But I'm curious as to, I guess, the role of the actual Chinese working people in what's been discussed so far, because obviously, their conversation is focused on the party itself and the elites of the party as they're kind of the movers and shakers of Chinese society presently. But, when we're talking about, this whole idea of common prosperity, it seems like Xi is at least ideologically making all these overtures to this sort of, socialist rhetoric of redistribution and such. But I'm just curious to what extent, like, if the Chinese Communist Party is so focused on just the elites and just the kind of central committee members, what is kind of the point of making these sort of big overtures to the people when they really have no ability to influence what's happening, it seems? And also to kind of the extent to which, whatever efforts may be being passed off as common prosperity are just really efforts to kind of shore up the party's own power instead of actually empowering,
I think we have lost Les. Are you there, Les?
Oh, sorry, apologies. Yeah, I cut out there. I'm basically just curious what role, kind of, if any, the actual like working class and the actual kind of working people of China actually play in its governance, since they didn't seem to be mentioned at all in this. And I'm just curious, considering Xi is making these overtures to them, if they actually have any influence at all.
I mean, it's a great question that is, I'll just say a few sentences and then kick it over to Victor. I mean, as a first approximation, I think you'd have to say that the role of the ordinary working people have in China's Communist Party formulation is zero. And that this is not an overture to them. This is a effort to create a nice, well, I think realistically it's an effort to do two things. One is an effort to slap down this, new capitalist elite and tell them exactly as Ma Huatong said, you should know your place and it's not at the top. And on the other hand, to put together a nice program that sounds good that can go into the 20th Party Congress. That would be my personal view. Very biased, but still.
Sure.
Yeah, I think sort of ordinary workers, by which I think we really mean migrant workers, because most, the majority of the workers doing either factory line or kind of lower level service sector jobs are migrant workers. I believe that is still the case. CK, is that still the case? I mean, that was the case. You're the real expert. And
yeah, well, it's still the case, but the question is whether they are powerful or not. I mean,
right. So the problem with migrant workers is that, I mean, they're workers and it's not a democracy. So that's already one factor. The other factor is that they're not even from their hukou designation, right? So if they're agitating for something in where the hukou is, there are potentially some real consequences to the local official. And the local official at least would have some kind of incentive to answer this agitation, either by force or sometimes even just giving in to their demands. But I think the fact that because they're working in places that are not their hukou residents in cities along the coast, the local governments have even less incentive to answer whatever demands they have. I mean, recently we see during this lockdown in Tianjin, the Tianjin government, made sure food was distributed to the residents, the official residents of Tianjin, and just completely forgot about the thousands upon thousands of migrant workers who work in Tianjin. They got nothing to eat. They were starving and they had to stage a protest, put it online. And finally, the Tianjin government gave them something to eat. So I don't know, CK, is this kind of a common thing?
Yeah, well, I won't go into detail, but I've seen just one big study, big data analysis of protest under Xi, and with the help of digital devices and surveillance and big data at the hands of the government, local government, they are doing very successfully to preempt protest even before protest happen. So basically, in this digital age, governance has been really perfected by the regime, and so it's not just workers' protests, but all kinds of social protests that have gone down. And I seldom hear them anymore. I study this thing, but it's nothing that is really emerging. But let me turn to my colleague Kwan Harris, who has the last question.
Right, thanks. So thanks to Bay and Victor. And my question is coming off of one of the points from our last panel on the Middle East, which is that relations between these different regions and the world economy in the wake of, whatever will be the post-pandemic kind of global economic situation. We can look at a region like Latin America, which essentially has experienced a new lost decade in growth rates, poverty rates, and real volatility in terms of the relationship between these countries and the world economy. Whereas other countries which have emerged relatively, and the key here is relatively unscathed compared to other regions, might have an advantage in both maybe reconsolidating some type of internal social compact, and also their advantages vis-a-vis the world economy, given the increases in inequality and destitution that seems like many regions are experiencing now. So I guess I would like to bring the panelists' wisdom, collective wisdom, to think just real fast on this question on China vis-a-vis the world economy in the wake of the pandemic. All of these challenges that we've discussed already noted, but it seems that, and again, some of this is propaganda, some of it reality, that they're emerging relatively unscathed compared to other regions. Will this give Chinese elites and Chinese states a leg up in interaction with the world economy, aside from the fact of the declining growth and inabilities, difficulties of reconstituting the economic models that they're attempting to do?
I'll take a flyer on that. I mean, I think the basic answer is yes. And that, with a big condition, which is they still have to open their borders and experience probably a wave of if they're lucky, Omicron and something else. But if they can get through that barrier, then yeah, they're in a formidable position. And I think the one open question is we know that there are many in the Chinese elite who say of Xi Jinping, look, you provoked conflict with the Americans unnecessarily. We could have deferred this for a decade, even if they're relatively cynical, and believe in the inevitability of great power conflict, they still would say, hey, we could have had another decade. So I think that's the domestic counterpart within China in that. But I think they are in a formidable position, and we underestimate it at our own risk.
Yeah, very quickly, I think within China, of course, within China, the government has done very well. We have some survey data, especially among this kind of urban, more educated population. Their trust in the Chinese government has gone up tremendously because they're seeing kind of seeming actual ineptness by which the United States and other countries have handled the pandemic. Globally, I think it's a bit more fragile. And the China model, especially the way that it controlled the pandemic, is really not exportable because it has to do with inherent state strength and how strong the ruling party is and how much grassroots penetration the government has. And that's just not exportable at this point. And so then different countries will support China rhetorically, depending on how much money they get from China. And again, if the money stops showing up, the support also is not going to be that great. So I think it is more fragile internationally.
I myself just think even more pessimistic. I'm not sure China got the right way to fight this pandemic. It looks unscathed right now, but zero tolerance means the whole population, we're talking about a large population, does not have immunity. Once Omicron goes in and they stop everything, quarantine everybody because of the zero tolerance, I don't know how the whole society and the economy could sustain it when the rest of the world is open to business. And China becomes this isolated big island, cut off from everything, and they're scared, and people would one day not be able to to tolerate that degree of authoritarianism. That would, so I'm not very optimistic that China can come out of this unscathed. Okay, I'm giving myself the last word of this panel, sorry. But thank you very much to everybody. And we have a very successful discussion. We have more than 100 people at the height of this. So thank you for your support. And please, next week, I think we have a panel on India. So please join us then. Thank you. Bye-bye.